January 6th, 1709. A washerwoman named Marguerite Tessier woke before dawn in a village 12 miles south of Paris, as she always did, to heat the water for the morning's work. She had done this every winter for 23 years. She knew exactly how long the kindling took to catch, how much wood it required to bring a full bucket to a boil, how the steam rose in the cold air and told her the water was ready. That morning, the water was already boiling. It just looked different. The bucket she had left outside overnight was a solid block of ice, not at the surface, not at the edges, solid, all the way through. She had never seen that before. She would spend the next 4 months watching her village disappear. So would you. This is the story of the Great Frost of 1709. The coldest winter in 500 years of European recorded history. The winter that froze the Baltic Sea solid enough to walk across. That killed the olive trees of Provence. Trees that had survived every plague year, every medieval famine, every war. That turned the rivers of France into roads, and the roads of France into killing grounds. Between 600,000 and 1.2 million people died. But before we get to that number, we need to understand what cold like this actually feels like. Because you have been cold before. You have shivered at a bus stop. You have worn a coat in April and felt personally wronged by the calendar. That is not this cold. Modern meteorologists, using ice core data and tree ring records, have reconstructed the temperatures of January 1709 in Paris. Thermometers recorded -15 to -20 degrees Celsius. In the countryside, -25, -30 in parts of northern France. The Baltic Sea froze over completely. People walked from Sweden to Denmark across the ice. That had not happened in recorded memory. It has not happened since. You are Marguerite Tessier. You are 41 years old. You live with your husband, your mother, and 3 children in a 2-room house with walls that were never meant to hold out a cold like this. You wake on January 7th and your water bucket is solid ice. You have dealt with this before. You break it up, melt snow over the fire, carry on. Your husband's wheat sits beneath the soil in its dormant winter state. Wheat is hardy. Everyone knows this. This is what you tell yourself. What you do not know is that winter wheat can survive a gradual freeze. Ice crystals form slowly between the cells. The plant endures. But the temperature on the night of January 6th dropped 10 degrees in a matter of hours across most of France, simultaneously, without warning. That kind of catastrophic drop forces ice crystals to form inside the cells themselves. They puncture the cell walls from within. The plant does not visibly die. It simply stops being alive. You will not know this for 3 months. You will not know until April, when the thaw comes and your husband's field simply does not turn green. Across France, between 80 and 90% of the winter wheat crop was destroyed. Not reduced, destroyed. The vineyards went with it. The olive groves of Provence, trees that were hundreds of years old, survivors of every catastrophe the continent had thrown at them since the Middle Ages, died. The olive cultivation boundary shifted permanently southward after 1709. You can still see the ghost of that catastrophe in where French olive oil comes from today. The livestock situation was, if anything, worse. Sheep and cattle kept outdoors froze to death where they stood. Contemporary accounts described fields containing dozens of animals, completely upright, as though life had simply been switched off mid-motion. Ice does not ask you to lie down first. And then there were the rivers. The Seine, the Loire, the Rhône, the Rhine. These were not just rivers. They were the arteries of European commerce, the highways along which grain moved from the regions that had it to the regions that needed it. In January 1709, every one of them froze solid, bank to bank. You cannot move grain on a river that has become a road. Moving grain overland at -20 was nearly impossible regardless. Horses died, wheels shattered on roads turned to iron. The food existed in theory, but food in one place and hungry people in another place, separated by a frozen river and roads from hell, is not food. It is geography mocking you. In February, temperatures rose above zero for roughly 2 weeks. People emerged from their houses and began cautiously to hope that the worst was behind them. Then it froze again. The second freeze, arriving in late February and lasting into early March, hit crops that had partially thawed and were therefore even more vulnerable than before. Anything that had tentatively begun to regenerate was destroyed a second time. But the real catastrophe of the thaw was hydraulic. When the ice on the rivers broke up, not gently, but in massive churning floods, it carried every everything frozen in place along with it. Bridges, mills, warehouses. The mill at Poissy, one of the key grinding facilities supplying Paris, was destroyed by ice damage in February. The mill at Corbeil, the mill at Montgeron. Grain does not become bread without being ground. Bread prices that had been worrying in January became genuinely alarming by March. They doubled, then tripled. The rough, dark bread that the poorest families had always been able to afford simply disappeared from many neighborhoods entirely. The bread riots began in earnest in April. Here is where we need to stop and correct something. The traditional account of 1709 treats it as an act of God, an unprecedented natural catastrophe, a king who did everything he could, a death toll that was tragic but unavoidable. This is incomplete. The winter of 1709 arrived at the end of a decade in which France had been fighting the War of the Spanish Succession. By 1709, the crown was spending approximately 60% of state revenue on the military. The treasury was, by any reasonable definition, bankrupt. Effective famine response requires money to purchase emergency grain from abroad, to enforce price controls, to move supplies by road when the rivers are frozen. Louis XIV's France could not fully afford to do any of these things. And there was a further problem. The Great Frost was not a French event. It was a continental event. France was attempting to buy emergency grain on a market where every country was simultaneously trying to buy emergency grain, using money it did not have, from sellers who had very little to sell. The soldiers were fed, the civilians were not. The war continued. In the spring of 1709, Archbishop Fenelon of Cambrai, a theologian who had previously been exiled for criticizing the crown, wrote again to Louis XIV. He described a France that was dying, not metaphorically, but literally. Villages where people were eating grass and bark. Cities where the poor were too weak to riot. Roads lined with people moving from place to place in search of food that did not exist anywhere they went. He did not directly blame the king. He was not a fool. But the implication was unmistakable. This was not only weather, this was governance. A village named Killed600, 20 kilometers from Nîmes, appears in the records of the intendants of Languedoc because its mayor, Jacques Bonnet, sent repeated petitions through the spring and summer of 1709. March. Emergency grain requested. The elderly and children were dying. May. The promised grain had never arrived. Families were eating boiled nettles. 2 families had abandoned the village entirely. Destination unknown. July. The petition is written in a noticeably shakier hand. Bonnet lists by name 11 residents who have died since his last letter. He asks, with what must have been considerable personal effort to phrase diplomatically, whether anyone at the intendants had actually read his previous communications. There is a response on file, dated August. It acknowledges the situation. It promises further investigation. There is no 4th petition from Jacques Bonnet. Historians estimate the excess mortality from the Great Frost and the famine that followed at between 600,000 and 1.2 million people in France alone. The range is wide because the poorest were also the least likely to have their deaths formally recorded. What we have are snapshots. Parish registers from the Beauvaisis region show mortality rates in 1709 running 2 to 3 times the annual baseline. The parish priest of Chailly-en-Bière kept a burial register that survives. In normal years, the village buried between 20 and 30 people. In 1709, he recorded 87 burials. In 1710, 64. He added marginal notes to many of the entries. Mort de misère, died of misery, a cause of death legally recognized in 18th century France. It appears in parish registers across the country in 1709 and 1710, with a frequency that no researcher who has spent time in those archives can encounter without some personal impact. A physician named Philippe Eke, writing in April 1709, describes a woman of perhaps 40 years who presented with weakness, inflammation of the gums, and skin eruptions on her legs. She told him she had eaten nothing of substance in 11 days. He wrote, "I could find no medicine equal to this complaint." Meanwhile, at Versailles, Louis XIV presided over his morning lever in a room so cold that breath was visible. The courtiers stood in their prescribed positions wearing their prescribed expressions and pretended this was normal. The performance of normality was itself a kind of policy. To acknowledge disorder would have been to acknowledge failure. The ceremony continued. The gold leaf kept catching the candlelight. The people dying on the roads between Paris and Versailles were not in a position to attend the lever and offer an alternative perspective. The Great Frost did not stop at the French border. In Sweden, Charles XII was campaigning in Ukraine. His army had spent months in conditions of -30 degrees without adequate supplies, unable to move logistics when horses froze overnight and wheels shattered on impact with frozen ground. At the Battle of Poltava on June 8, 1709, Peter the Great's Russian army destroyed the Swedish force. The Swedish Empire, which had dominated northern Europe for most of the 17th century, was broken in a single afternoon. Historians argue about the causes of Poltava. They always will. But an army that has spent a winter at -30, that has watched its horses die and its supply lines collapse, does not fight the same battle it would have fought in a different winter. In Britain, the Thames froze solid enough for a frost fair, the last genuine one in the river's history. Londoners set up stalls on the ice, lit bonfires on a frozen river, and called it entertainment. They did not know it was the last time. Nobody knows something is the last time while it is happening. Marguerite Tessier disappears from the records after the summer of 1709. She was not a duchess or a philosopher or an archbishop. She left no letters and no memoirs. She appears only in a single parish tax assessment from 1706, which lists her husband's occupation and the number of their dependents, and in the account of her village's harvest records, which stopped being maintained in any coherent way after the spring of 1709 because the person who maintained them had other concerns. Whether she survived the winter, whether she was among the dead whose cause was written in the margin as mort de misère, whether her children ate that spring, the records do not say. What the records do say is that the court at Versailles continued its ceremonies. The fires in the Hall of Mirrors were eventually lit. The lever proceeded as scheduled. The gold leaf caught the light in a room full of people who were hungry enough to feel the cold, but never hungry enough to die of it. The wine froze in the king's cellars. The people froze in the fields. The rivers stopped moving and the mills stopped turning, and the bread disappeared from the tables of the people who had never had enough of it to begin with. The men who wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789 were, on average, in their 40s. Their parents had been children in 1709. You do not need to draw a straight line between a frozen river and a revolution, but the line is there. It runs through every village register where a priest wrote mort de misère in the margin, through every unanswered petition, through every ceremony that continued while the roads outside filled with the dying. The Great Frost of 1709 did not cause the French Revolution. It simply made certain things impossible to forget for a generation that grew up hearing about them, in a country that never fully explained why they had been allowed to happen. In the distance, 80 years away, someone was sharpening something.